Welcome to This Explainer. Today, we're going to look at the human body from a totally different angle. I want you to think of yourself not just as a biological organism, but, well, as a highly efficient, incredibly complex machine. And right there, dead center in that machine, is the most vital engine you own, your heart. So in This Explainer, we're taking a journey from basic mechanics all the way to advanced troubleshooting. We'll figure out how this human pump actually works, how to listen to its warning signs, and exactly what chemical wrenches we use to fix it when things inevitably go wrong.
What's up, guys? Welcome back to the Next Hub. This is your go-to space for everything self-improvement, human behavior, and the psychology behind success. If you're ready to upgrade your mindset and understand the world around you a little better, hit that subscribe button. Let's get straight into today's video.
Okay, let's dive into this. Here's our roadmap for today. 1. Anatomy of the pump. 2. Listening to the engine. 3. Assessing the warning signs. 4. When the pump fails. And 5. The medical toolbox.
Section 1. Anatomy of the pump. How the engine moves fluid.
Okay, so to truly understand the heart, you really have to follow the flow. Picture this. Unoxygenated blood that's already traveled around and dropped off its oxygen to your body, it's making its way back to the heart. It arrives through the superior and inferior vena cava, plus the heart's own coronary sinus, and it dumps right into the very first receiving chamber, the right atrium. From there, it pushes down through the tricuspid valve and straight into the right ventricle. Now, this right ventricle, it's a pumping chamber. It gives a big squeeze and sends that unoxygenated blood shooting out through the pulmonary artery directly to your lungs, all so it can pick up a fresh, vital supply of oxygen. Let's move to and see how this builds, because now we have freshly oxygenated blood. Once it picks up that oxygen in the lungs, it heads back to the left side of the heart through the pulmonary veins, entering the left atrium. It drops down through the mitral or bicuspid valve and into the absolute star of the show, the left ventricle. Now this chamber is thick, it's muscular, and honestly it has to be. With one massive, powerful squeeze, it propels that fresh blood out through the aorta to feed your brain, your organs, literally every single tissue in your body. It's an incredible feat of engineering. Section 2. Listening to the engine. Translating sounds to function.
Now, when you press a stethoscope to someone's chest, you aren't just listening to some random generic beat, you are actually listening to a very specific sequence of mechanical doors slamming shut. A really handy way to remember the 4 heart valves and the order they close in is the acronym MTAP. It stands for Many Things Are Possible, and that translates directly to the mitral, tricuspid, aortic, and pulmonic valves. Just keeping MTAP in the back of your mind helps you track exactly where you are in the cardiac cycle at any given second.
Right, so that classic heartbeat sound we all know, the lub-dub, that is actually the sound of those specific valves snapping shut because of pressure changes. The lub, or what we call S1, is the sound of your atrioventricular valves, the mitral and tricuspid closing. That marks the start of systole, which is when the ventricles are squeezing. Then you have the dub, or S2. That's the closing of your semilunar valves, the aortic and pulmonic, and that marks the start of diastole, which is the relaxation and filling phase of the heart. So it's lub-dub, squeeze, relax, over and over.
But, sometimes this engine makes some pretty abnormal sounds, and we call these gallops. If you hear a sort of B-lub-dub, that extra little beat is in S4. That happens when the atrium is trying to kick blood into a really stiff, hypertrophied ventricle. On the other hand, if you hear a lub-dub-bub, well, that's an S3, and that often signals acute systolic heart failure or fluid overload. Because these are really low-pitched sounds, you're going to hear them best if you use the bell of your stethoscope, specifically when you have the patient rolled over onto their left side. That position brings the left ventricle much closer to the chest wall, making it way easier to hear.
Section 3. Assessing the warning signs when the engine complains. When your heart muscle is starved of oxygen, it complains. And let me tell you, it complains loudly. Patients describe this in incredibly visceral ways, like, it feels like there's an actual elephant sitting on my chest. It can be this intense pressure, a fullness, or a crushing sensation that shoots up to the neck, the jaw, or down the left arm. And it's very often paired with cold sweats, dizziness, and just overwhelming nausea. Basically, this is the body's ultimate emergency alarm system screaming that the heart muscle isn't getting the oxygen it desperately needs. So the crucial point here is really understanding the difference between ischemia and a myocardial infarction. Think of ischemia like a yellow yield sign. It's an early warning. The tissue is starved of oxygen, maybe from a vasospasm or some plaque buildup, but, and this is absolutely key, it is still viable. If we can restore the blood flow, that tissue recovers. But a myocardial infarction, or an MI, That is a blazing red stop sign. The tissue has died. And dead tissue doesn't just stop working peacefully. It turns into a stiff, rigid wall that permanently and severely compromises the heart's ability to contract efficiently.
And this is exactly why you'll constantly hear the phrase time is muscle in emergency rooms. Literally, time is muscle. The longer the heart goes without oxygen, the more tissue dies. Period. And because that dead tissue creates a permanent stiff block in the engine wall, early recognition and rapid intervention aren't just kind of important. They are the absolute determining factors in whether we can preserve the mechanical function of that patient's heart for the rest of their life.
Section 4. When the pump fails, congestive heart failure.
Let's pose a straightforward mechanical question here. What actually happens when the left ventricle, that massive, powerful chamber responsible for pushing blood to your entire body, becomes just too stiff from years of hypertension or too weak from an MI to actually do its job? Well, it creates a massive, systemic circulatory traffic jam.
Think about the progression. If the left ventricle can't efficiently pump blood out into the aorta, that fluid has to go somewhere, right? So it flows backward. It backs right up into the left atrium. And where does the left atrium get its blood? The lungs. So the fluid backs up into the pulmonary veins, and eventually it seeps out into the actual lung tissue itself. The tiny air sacs in your lungs, your alveoli, they essentially fill up and turn into little water balloons. This is what we call pulmonary edema, and it's the exact reason why patients in heart failure feel incredibly short of breath. They're basically drowning in their own fluid.
And we can actually track this fluid backup systemically by checking the patient's legs. When fluid backs up like this, gravity takes over and it pools in the lowest parts of the body. If you press firmly on the shins or the tops of the feet, you might see pitting edema, which is where your thumb leaves a literal indentation in the swollen tissue. Now, while seeing edema alone doesn't instantly diagnose heart failure, it's an absolutely crucial physical tool to track a patient's fluid volume over time, especially as we start giving them medications to pull that excess fluid off.
Section 5. The medical toolbox, pharmacological wrenches.
First up in our toolbox are the beta blockers. But to really grasp how they work, we have to look at normal receptors. There's a super easy trick to remember this. You have one heart, so beta-1 receptors are mostly located on the heart. You have two lungs, so beta-2 receptors are mostly on the lungs. Normally, when adrenaline or epinephrine hits those beta-1 receptors, your heart rate and pumping velocity completely skyrocket. When it hits the beta-2 receptors, your airways dilate wide open so you can take in more oxygen. It's your classic built-in fight-or-flight response. And this brilliantly illustrates how beta blockers step in to help. They act exactly like a chemical key that fits perfectly into the lock of those receptors, and then they just sit there. They block the pathway. So when your body gets stressed and dumps a bunch of adrenaline, that adrenaline just bounces right off because the receptor is already occupied. The result? The heart rate stays calm, it stays low, and we drastically reduce the workload on our damaged engine. It's genius.
But of course, there's a catch. If a patient takes a non-selective beta blocker, it's going to block those beta-2 receptors in the lungs as well. That prevents bronchodilation, which means if a patient has asthma, it can trigger some very severe breathing problems. On top of that, for diabetic patients, a dropping blood sugar normally triggers a really fast heart rate as a built-in warning sign. A beta blocker will completely mask that fast heart rate, effectively hiding the crucial warning signs of hypoglycemia. So we have to be extremely careful.
Okay, let's switch gears to another incredibly common class of cardiac meds, ACE inhibitors. To really understand how to use these in the real world, let's put our knowledge to the test with a high-stakes clinical scenario. Imagine this classic case study. You're caring for a patient who's already taking daily diuretics, meaning they are actively losing fluid every day. The doctor has just prescribed their very first dose of captopril, which is an ACE inhibitor designed to lower their blood pressure. What is the absolute safest action you can take right before handing them that pill? Take a second to think about it.
Now, what's really interesting about this is that the safest action is actually incredibly simple. You educate the patient to take that first dose at bedtime. Why? Because ACE inhibitors carry a really significant risk of what's called first-dose orthostatic hypotension, basically a sudden massive drop in blood pressure the second the patient tries to stand up. Because they're already on a diuretic, their overall fluid volume is low, which massively amplifies this risk. By having them take it right before they go to sleep, you ensure they are horizontal, they're safe, and they are protected from passing out and taking a nasty fall. So, we've covered the anatomy, the acoustics, the failures, and the chemical fixes of the human pump. It is a miraculous, resilient machine, but it absolutely demands maintenance and attention. Which leaves me with one final question for you to ponder today. Now that you understand the mechanics,
the fluid dynamics, and the critical warning signs. Are you listening closely enough to the warning sounds of your own engine? Thanks so much for joining me on this explainer. I really hope this helps you keep your pump running smoothly.